Good morning. I'm Anne Kelso, CEO of the National Health and Medical Research Council, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the social and ethical issues raised by mitochondrial donation. So thank you to all the participants who are joining us today across the country. I'm delighted to have you with us. I'd like to start also by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land here in Canberra, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Also to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining the webinar today from various places around the country. As you might know, NHMRC is Australia's leading body for health and medical research. NHMRC has legislative roles in funding health and medical research and research training, also in developing evidence-based health advice and promoting the highest ethical standards in health and medical research. NHMRC also works with other areas of government to respond to a range of health-related issues. As you may know, in 2018, the Senate Community Affairs References Committee conducted an inquiry into the science of mitochondrial donation and related matters. As part of the Australian Government's response to the inquiry, the Minister for Health, Greg Hunt, asked NHMRC to consult with the community and with experts and key stakeholders on the possible introduction of mitochondrial donation in Australia. At the end of this process, NHMRC will provide advice directly to the government on the views of the Australian community and a number of specific questions that were also raised by the inquiry last year. So today's webinar is a key component of our public consultation. It's an opportunity for the general community to be informed about the issues and to interact with experts in the field. It's also an opportunity for me to hear directly from views from right across Australia. So I'm joined today by experts from NHMRC's Mitochondrial Donation Expert Working Committee, Professor Patrick Tam from the Children's Medical Research Institute in Sydney, who has expertise in the science of embryology and developmental biology, Professor Diane Nickel from the University of Tasmania, who has expertise in legislative and regulatory frameworks relevant to mitochondrial donation, Professor John Christodoulou, AM, from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, who has expertise in the genetics of mitochondrial disease and/or genetic modification, and Mr. Sean Murray from the Mito Foundation, who has expertise in the consumer health issues for people with mitochondrial disease. So the format of our webinar this morning is the following. We'll view a short video, approximately 6 minutes, to set the stage for discussion. And this video features people talking about mitochondrial donation from a variety of perspectives. The experts will then introduce themselves, and then you will be invited to submit your questions via the question window that's on the same web page that you're on now, and the experts will be invited to answer your questions. Then, before we close, I'll remind you about the next steps that you can take to continue to be involved in the consultation. I'd like to remind all participants today to be respectful in your questions. Please be aware that other people participating in this webinar could come from a variety of different backgrounds and experiences, and they may of course include people who are currently living with mitochondrial disease, either themselves or in their family. Finally, it's important for you to know that the Australian Government and NHMRC don't have preconceived ideas about the outcomes of this discussion today or the broader consultation. NHMRC is impartial in this process. Our job is to pass the advice we receive from the community on to the Minister for Health for the government's consideration. So now we'll turn to the video.
Mitochondrial diseases are problems in energy generation. So we eat food, sugars, fats and proteins, and we have to convert the energy in the foods to energies our cells can use. So the mitochondria are really important to essentially every organ in the body.
And so mitochondrial disease is when that isn't working properly. And so people suffer from all sorts of different conditions.
There are a number of people in the community who suffer from severe mitochondrial disease, and as this is an inherited disorder, whole families can be severely affected.
I first became aware of mitochondrial disease when my brother was diagnosed in 1998. Since that time, many other members of my family, including me, have been diagnosed with mitochondrial disease.
Mitochondrial diseases are actually 300 different diseases, so there's quite a bit of variability, but many of the children die in the first days or weeks or months of life, and at the moment we have no effective treatments.
It's gone on to claim the lives of my brother and my mother and other loved ones in my family, and as far as we know, it's impacted every generation of my family. At the moment, one child born in Australia every week will develop a life-threatening form of mitochondrial disease.
Therefore, there's interest in mitochondrial donation because it's a new technology which offers potential hope of reducing the risk of transmission of mitochondrial disease to future generations.
Mitochondrial donation has been pioneered in the UK, and it's a way to allow couples to have their nuclear genes put into a healthy mitochondrial DNA background using a donor egg, so that the child will be at much reduced risk of having disease.
But there are some special features of this technology. It involves using genetic material from more than two people, and for this reason it's currently prohibited by our legislation in Australia.
When our laws were written, mitochondrial donation was not possible. We need to now change the law if it is going to be a possibility, but we need to think about the implications.
We need to think very carefully about whether we want to use technologies where DNA changes can then be inherited in subsequent generations.
A further issue is about donors. This technology needs donor eggs in order to work, and how do we use them in the process? What are their rights and interests as well?
We also have to ask ourselves the question, are there more effective ways of doing this? Maybe less complex, maybe simpler.
And then a further implication is, if we say yes to mitochondrial donation, does that mean that we're then saying yes to something else as well, like choosing other kinds of diseases that might not be as serious, or choosing human traits?
And for something as important as this, I think we need to be as confident as we can be that we're offering people the best path forward.
We've brought together information from a range of experts in science, in medicine, in ethics and the law to help you explore the issues before you tell us what you think.
So options for people who have mitochondrial disease in their family are a mixed bag. They have several options available to them, so they could choose to not have children at all. They could choose to look at adoption or fostering of children. They could become pregnant and carry a natural pregnancy but have it tested for the genetics. Or they could create an embryo through IVF and have that tested for the genetics. Or they could use an egg donor, or somebody who a completely healthy egg. All of them are good options, but they're not. None of them are really very viable.
So for families who have a high chance of passing on mitochondrial disease to their children, at the moment there's not a huge number of options for them, and for those options that do exist, some of them mean that they won't be able to have a child who has a genetic relationship with both of its parents. And for many families that's a very important thing, and it is a key driver for people to seek mitochondrial donation.
I think mitochondrial donation just expands the options. So that people will still have to use IVF. It may not be effective, we don't know that yet, but it's certainly creating another option for people to have their own genetic children, which is very important to them.
But it's important that we understand that it differs in some really key ways from our current standard IVF practices. And those are that we'd be combining the components of eggs from two different women, that we would be utilizing DNA from 3 different individuals, and that the new gene combinations that we create would be inherited by subsequent generations. And there's also some really big unknowns about the biology. We don't exactly understand how the mitochondria are going to replicate in the embryo and whether or not the disease may rebound.
We know that there is some risk of carryover mutant mitochondria, and therefore that there is some risk that the child who may be born may have mitochondrial disease. I guess one of my concerns in this is the child is the only person in all of this who cannot give consent.
In the UK, it's gone through a really exhaustive series of preclinical tests, scientific review, ethical review, community engagement, and it's now going ahead in clinical practice. We still don't know everything about the potential risks of mitochondrial donation. However, many researchers believe that those risks are relatively low compared to the community risk of having a child with disease, and that it's an appropriate time to implement this into clinical practice.
It's important here to have a balanced conversation. Mitochondrial donation offers a lot of hope to couples who are at high risk of having a child with mitochondrial disease. At the same time, it's important not to overhype what this technology can do. It is not a cure for mitochondrial disease, yet what it can offer is another reproductive option for couples who don't have very many at the moment.
My hope for my family and for all people affected by mitochondrial disease is that they have available to them the choice to use mitochondrial donation to avoid transmitting mitochondrial disease to the next generation of Australians.
It's important that we consider not only the opportunities that this technology offers, but that we consider the risks and the unknowns.
If it's going to come within our legal framework, we need to consider the implications for the donors of the DNA, for the parents of the child, and for the future child and their children.
The seriousness of this technology means that it's not just up to scientists to decide, it's not just up to the government to decide. We want to hear a wide range of views and ideas about whether this is something that Australia should make legal.
We want you to think about this new technology, have a look at the issues paper on our website, and tell us what you think. Should Australia change the legislation to enable mitochondrial donation to be introduced into clinical practice? If you'd like to watch that video again, it'll be on our website soon. And so now it's a chance to meet our experts, and I'll start with Patrick Tam and ask if he could introduce himself.
I'm Patrick Tam. I'm an embryologist with research interest in understanding the control of very early development in the context of how is the blueprints of development being established very early on in life. I'm also interested in the research on the disease mechanism of rare genetic diseases and the functional aspect of stem cell differentiation. And all these would be translated eventually into the treatment of rare genetic diseases and implementation of stem cell medicine.
Thank you. John.
I'm John Christodoulou. I'm a paediatrician initially by training, and then have specialised in clinical genetics, and I've worked for over 25 years in the diagnosis and treatment of children with mitochondrial diseases, and at a research level I've been involved in trying to identify the causative genes and understand the biology behind those in the mitochondrial disorders.
Thank you. Diane.
Thank you, Anne. I'm Diane Nickel. I'm a Professor of Law at the University of Tasmania, and I'm based in Hobart. I was also trained as a cell biologist many years ago, so I bring that background in science and law. I'm the director of our Centre for Law and Genetics, which looks at the ethical, legal and social implications of genetics, stem cell technology and related technologies, and we've been doing this for the past 25 years. I'm also, as well as a member of the Mitochondrial Donation Expert Working Committee, I'm chair of the NHMRC Embryo Research Licensing Committee. And that committee is tasked with issuing licenses for research involving human embryos.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Sean Murray. I'm the CEO of the Mito Foundation. I also have a family connection with mitochondrial disease, so I guess I've had personal and direct family experience in living with mitochondrial disease, and through our work at the Mito Foundation we provide support to patients and to their families who have mitochondrial disease, as well as undertake advocacy efforts in relation to mitochondrial disease and funding of research into mitochondrial disease as well.
Well, thank you everyone, and our 4 experts are here to answer your questions. So I'm going to pose the first question to Patrick. Is it possible that some genetic negatives could be inherited via mitochondrial donation other than mitochondrial disease?
It is not known whether there is any negativity in that context, but some research in stem cells indicate there is a possibility of incompatibility between the mitochondrial genome and the nuclear genome in affecting the function of the nuclear genome. But that is not established yet in any clinical situation. So as far as we know at this moment, the negativity is not beyond the mitochondrial disease.
Thank you. So the second question we've received is how long is the consultation and process of NHMRC likely to take? So I'll answer that question. We've been asked to report to the Minister by the end of the year. So our formal consultation process will close on the 29th of November at the close of submissions through our online portal, and we'll talk about that at the end of this webinar. So that means it's a fairly tight timeline, but it's very important that we can report back to the government before Christmas. So the next question is, what scientific research was undertaken in the UK prior to mitochondrial donation being legalised here? And again, perhaps Patrick or John, do you think? John, would you like to answer that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, in fact, there's been a very active research in the application of mitochondrial donation in a clinical setting for well over a decade in the UK. Much of the work has been led there, and there's also been work in the US, but the work that eventually led to the change of legislation in the UK was based on the UK research. And in fact, parallel to that, or in conjunction to that, there was a very strong and rigorous ethical debate around the implications of the technology before the legislation was changed.
Thank you. So the next question we've received is quite a complex one. So what are the main things we should be thinking about if we're going to bring in mitochondrial donation? So let me start by making a few points about this, but then perhaps any of the others here at the table may wish to contribute, because this really goes to the heart of our consultation process. So the first thing is this is a process which is currently not legal in Australia, and that's for a couple of reasons. The main restrictions that Diane may wish to talk more about are that our current legal situation is that we do not allow creation of human embryos with genetic material from more than 2 people. And clearly mitochondrial donation includes bringing in mitochondrial DNA from a third party, The second reason that mitochondrial donation isn't currently legal in Australia is because it introduces changes into the embryo that will be inherited by future generations. So these are 2 of the core ethical issues that we're asking the community to consider. The fact that the embryo would include genetic material from more than 2 people, and that the resultant new combination of genetic material would be inherited by future generations. So this is not a treatment for the individual who has mitochondrial disease. It's a process, a technology that will reduce the risk of the baby born of parents with mitochondrial disease in the family being transmitted to that child and to future generations. As the technology hasn't yet been widely used around the world, then there are also questions of how well it works and how safe it is, and whether there are other issues that might arise if it's introduced. And then I think a fourth element that we need to be thinking about is how having a third person involved in the creation of a new human life affects family relationships, how important it is for the child who's born to know who donated the mitochondria, and other sorts of issues related to family relationships. So those are the ones that come to my mind immediately, but our other experts may wish to add to that or to provide their own perspectives.
So,
Diane.
And if I could talk a little bit about the laws that govern the use of this technology. So the laws came into Australia in around 2002, and that was at a time when people were really actively debating the whole issue of reproductive cloning. So a few years earlier, Dolly the sheep had been born, but it was also the start of the use of embryonic stem cell technology. So the idea was that embryonic stem cell technology could offer real promising developments in terms of cures for some of the most terrible diseases, but there was concern about the idea of cloning people. So these laws were passed at that time, and they're quite restrictive in what is and isn't allowed. So, for example, the Prohibition of Human Cloning for Reproduction Act, sorry for the long title, bans reproductive cloning, but it also has these provisions that Anne already mentioned about creating embryos that have DNA from more than two parents, or creating heritable changes in the human embryo. So all of these things would need to be considered if we were going to, if the government particularly made the decision to go down the path of legalising mitochondrial donation. When the legislation was brought in 2002, there was extensive public consultation, and I think the important thing now is to go through the same level of extensive public consultation to see if we're ready to change the laws, specifically in relation to mitochondrial donation.
Thank you. I think it's really important also that we think about the human aspects of this and the potential of this technology to resolve a really serious problem in families. And so I wonder if I could ask Sean Murray to comment from that point of view, and also address the other issue that's come up as a question here: what's it like to have mitochondrial disease?
Yeah, well, that's not necessarily an easy question to answer in its own right. I guess mitochondrial diseases are varied. They impact people very differently. They can impact children from the first days of life. And we certainly know of people in the mitochondrial disease community who are living in their 80s with mitochondrial disease, albeit in probably a milder form. So I think some of the things that come to my mind when we think about what's it like to live with mitochondrial disease is, obviously there's the direct health consequences, so the direct impact that the disease is having on a person's health. But also then the ripple effect of what that means for people's family dynamics, what it means for their ability to work if they're an adult, what sort of impact it has on families if they have a child with mitochondrial disease. Often we have one parent deciding not to work, and that has financial issues on families, etc. So as with many chronic or severe diseases, mitochondrial disease has an impact beyond just the direct health of the person affected and the family member affected. And that can then have, one of the things we've heard from the mitochondrial disease community when we did a survey recently was that it has a significant impact on their mental health as well, whether it's the patient themselves or the family living with somebody with mitochondrial disease. This disease is creeping into every aspect of a patient or their family's lives as well. So in terms of then, what should we be considering when looking, exploring this possibility of legalising mitochondrial donation, I think obviously we have to start with making sure that it's safe and effective from a medical and a scientific perspective. I think it is really important that we explore the ethical and social issues around this and really give some good thought to that and make sure that all of those things have been well considered. And then also I think it's really important that we should gauge the public's opinion. Certainly, this doesn't exist in Australia yet, so it's important for us to understand, well, what is the appetite of the Australian population for the introduction of this? And then I don't think we can lose sight of, we have to keep in mind the patient's perspective, and we need to do a deliberation on this very thoroughly. But we should keep in mind that real people are waiting for a decision on this that will impact their choice about the possibility of having a child that's related to them.
Yes. Well, thank you both for those comments. The next question I can see on the screen is, what's the likely time frame for legislation to be in place to allow clinical practice? So, of course, changing laws, and particularly ones that are as potentially complex as the laws that control the use of human embryos, is not a very fast process. So the first thing is that following this consultation and the advice that NHMRC will give to the government will need to consider whether it wishes to change the laws to introduce mitochondrial donation into clinical practice in this country. So that's the first thing, make the decision. And then the process of drafting legislation in order to allow for this technology is not a straightforward process. So I don't think we can expect this to be completed in a year if the government makes that decision. It's likely to take somewhat longer than that, and a little bit difficult to put a deadline on it. Diane, would you agree with that?
Oh, I would absolutely agree with that, Anne. And as well as that, once the legislation has been drafted, of course it then has to go to Parliament, and it has to pass both houses of Parliament. And it's always really a little bit difficult to predict which way Parliament will go on these things, but I would imagine that this is a sort of type of legislation that's apolitical. You couldn't say that one party will be aligned in one particular direction and another party will be aligned in another direction. So it might end up being a smoother passage than other legislation. I should just add, when the original laws went through that I talked about in 2002, parliamentarians were given a free vote, so they didn't have to follow party lines. It was decided that they should vote on their own conscience, and that might be the case for this sort of technology, but it's difficult to predict in advance.
Yes, so thank you very much. The next question we received is, why is it called three-person IVF? And shall I ask John to address that?
So traditional IVF technologies involve an egg cell from the mother and sperm from the father. In this situation, what we're trying to do is replace the mitochondrial DNA within the mitochondria that primarily are in the egg cell with mitochondria that do not carry the mitochondrial DNA mutation. And so the only available source of the mitochondria that don't have a mitochondrial mutation is from an egg cell from an unrelated donor. So in that sense, there is some genetic contribution from three individuals into the ultimate fertilized embryo that would go on to become, hopefully, the unaffected baby.
Thank you. So perhaps, John, I can also direct the next question to you. Have any recent results been revealed from the UK candidates who went through the process?
So it's still early days. The setup in the UK is that there are two processes involved. One is potential IVF facilities that would be offering the technology need to be accredited, and so that's a process that takes place. And then the second process is families who wish to avail themselves of the technology are reviewed by an expert panel to confirm that for that family it is appropriate technology to be used. And so as the current situation is, there is one IVF group in the UK that has been approved for this, and my understanding is that a number of families have gone through the process of being assessed for suitability, and some have been approved, and so they are in train. But we have no information about what the status of those particular couples are at the moment, and I think that there is a potential problem we have there in that, well, not problem but issue, in that, of course, family confidentiality is of prime significance here, and it may be that we do not hear much specific information about outcomes in specific family instances.
And will there be destruction of healthy embryos in the mitochondrial donation process?
Well, I guess you have to look at what you mean by healthy embryos. The process itself is a very specific process, and so in an ideal world the technology will work once, but if the technology doesn't work and an embryo goes through the process and is not viable, then you could lose that. You could consider that as a destruction, or it's actually a loss of an embryo. So there may be several instances where this needs to be done before you have viable embryos that could then be implanted.
Yes. Essentially, as with IVF already,
Right.
but with some additional complexity because this is a different technology.
That's right.
Yes. So, can the technology completely eliminate the risk of passing the gene? Are there any follow-up case studies in the UK? Again, this might be for John or for Patrick.
So there is some so-called carryover of the mitochondria that have the mutation, but the way the technology is derived, the carryover is usually vastly small compared to the number of donated mitochondria. There is a theoretical risk that the carryover mitochondria could increase in their proportion, which then could potentially make the risk of mitochondrial disease to some extent being seen in the offspring. If that would happen, one would think that still the donated mitochondria would far outnumber the carryover mitochondria, and so if there were disease to develop, one would predict it would be much milder. But at this point in time, at least in various animal studies where this has been done, there hasn't been evidence to suggest that this is a significant issue. In the human context, we just don't have a lot of information. We're aware of one unofficial instance of mitochondrial donation in a family, and the limited information we have would suggest that that baby has done well, but it's still very early days and we don't have a lot of information.
Yes, thank you. There's a question that's disappeared from the screen that's about what's in the best from an ethical point of view, what would be in the best interests of the child? And I think I'd be interested to ask Sean about this question, because of course you can speak from a personal point of view and we'll be thinking very much about the child born of this technology.
Yeah, I think to answer the question, it depends on one's perspective, but I guess what would be the from an ethical perspective, what would be the child's interest in having an increased risk of having disease? I think this technique exists for the purpose of preventing the transmission of disease, and so that comes down to a choice around potential health and probable an impact on lifespan or a reduction in lifespan if they have mitochondrial disease versus avoidance of passing on, of having that disease, and what implications that has for differences in their lives. Obviously, one of the considerations is that the child itself doesn't have a say in this process because they're not around yet. But equally, then any child born doesn't have a say on whether they're born or not. And I think that most of us in society strive to have health. I mean, our whole society is built around health systems, etc., that strives to improve health. And to me, that's what this technique is about, is ensuring that we have healthy children born. So that would be some of the things that one should consider when looking at the ethics from the child's perspective.
Yes.
And I guess we could say that the issue of a child not having a say in this is not necessarily a new phenomenon, because that's been the way it's been with prenatal testing and in vitro fertilisation techniques.
Yeah, it's certainly not unique to mitochondrial donation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. There are some downstream ethical issues for the child as they grow up and might wish to know about, if they know that they have been born as a result of mitochondrial donation, then they may wish to know who donated their mitochondria. And so there are some interesting ethical considerations there that we can think about how children might feel about that, what information they'd like to have. So these are some of the special aspects of the ethics of this situation. Now, there was a question there about why the legislation was changed in the UK but not in the United States of America, and I wonder whether Diane would be prepared to tackle that one.
I could give it a go, certainly. Of course, all of these changes in law are backed up by deep social consideration of the issues, and of course, different societies will come to different conclusions. So in the UK, for example, the view very strongly after a whole series of public consultations was that society seemed ready to adopt this technology with appropriate regulations in place. There hasn't been quite the same level of engagement in the US, but the preliminary view that came out of some analysis was that there would seem to be a view that this did sort of amount to germline modification, and therefore when the changes were made, they would affect female children rather than male children. And so, if anything, if it was going to come in place in the US, it might be that it would be restricted to male children. So that was the finding of that report, but then it was never pursued further. So US Parliament was not ready at that point to really engage in that process. And I think that this is, as I say, it's a social question. It's a question of whether society and parliamentarians are quite ready to embrace these really quite significant developments. So I see that these debates might well happen again in the US once we've seen what happens in the UK, but it's just not the time yet in that country.
Yes, and I think it's interesting to note that Australia over generations has been at the forefront of consideration of these major ethical issues, and also in the development of new reproductive technologies, because IVF was developed first in the UK and in Australia. And so I think that we have the chance to make decisions about these important technologies ourselves in the context of our own society and our own community values. So we can learn a lot from what's happened in other countries, but we can also make our own decisions and considerations.
I agree that we have to do what's right for Australia and Australian society. But as you say, be informed by what's happened elsewhere.
Yes. So another question on the screen now is, in the event that the law were to be changed, would that imply treatment being available in the public health system? Perhaps I can just say very briefly that I think it's premature for us to know that if the law were to be changed and this practice were to be introduced, what decisions would be made about how it was available. That is a step further down the track, and I don't think we at this table today know exactly what would happen.
And could I just say as well that there are, of course, two quite distinct and separate regulatory regimes to do with approval of something and putting something on the public benefit system. So this comes up all the time in relation to new drugs, for example. You will see that in many instances these new drugs will be available for treatment of cancer, for example, but they'll be extraordinarily expensive because they're not available on the public system, and it will take some time and a totally different regulatory environment to answer those questions.
Yes. Another question is, will the Australian government be facilitating families accessing the UK, and if so, in what time frame? So my understanding is that for the moment the Australian government has said it will not support itself sending families to the UK to enable them to have access to this treatment. But this is a question for government and not for us at this table. John, did you have anything to add to that from your knowledge of the situation?
The only thing I would add is that the capacity to go to the UK is available, so the organisation that is offering it has indicated that they are prepared to accept people from other countries. It will be a limited resource, but that is still a possibility. But yes, I don't have any additional insights into any time frame for when the government might or might not agree to support this from a financial perspective.
Yes, thank you. So how many people might use mitochondrial donation technology if it's introduced? I guess it's very difficult to know how many people would seek to use it, but we do have data that suggests that about 60 babies each year are born with mitochondrial disease that's sufficiently severe that it will affect their quality and quantity of life. So that's about one baby every week who's born with potentially severe mitochondrial disease. The question of whether all families who have such children would want to use mitochondrial donation for their future children is, of course, up to the families themselves. Are there things we don't know about mitochondrial donation, and how do we know it's safe? So, John?
I'm channeling Mr. Rumsfeld here, unknown knowns and unknown unknowns.
Yes.
So, yes, I'm sure there are things we don't know about mitochondrial donation, but what we do know so far in the test tube based situation and also in work that's been done in primates is that it does appear to be safe, and there have certainly been monkeys born of the mitochondrial donation techniques that are now approaching adulthood and appear to be perfectly healthy. So that's of course incredibly encouraging. In terms of one of the questions that has been raised is, could mitochondrial DNA from a donor in some way be incompatible with the nuclear DNA of the biological parents? And as Patrick has said, in stem cell based research, there has been some suggestion that this could be an issue, but there's more recent work, again in primates, to suggest, at least at this stage, that there doesn't appear to be a major impact in the limited studies that have been done to date. And I have to stress that the work that's been done so far, whilst it's been extensive, has not had a long-term carry-on effect. So we don't know whether there may well be some issues in the longer term that we're unaware of at the moment.
Yes, thank you. And so Patrick might like to add to that, but also address the next question, which is, can the embryo reject the donor mito DNA like an organ transplant?
There is no evidence from animal study that the engrafted or transfer mitochondria are being rejected by the host cells. But there are cases during the development of the embryo that the mitochondria are selectively passed on to the daughter cells, resulting in the selection of either the healthy mitochondria or, in a worse way, selection of the unhealthy mitochondria. That has been done, shown in research done in Newcastle University in a process called purification during development. The purification in either direction. So there's a potential that the mitochondrial complement is not always inherited among the cells in the uniform way, and that is one of the issues that need further study.
Yes, thank you. And Patrick, perhaps you could also answer, is there any research happening in Australia about mitochondrial donation yet?
In the law governing the use of human embryo for research, there are provisions that a certain technique of mitochondrial donation could be used for research purposes. But the prohibition actually prevents the other alternative procedures from even research on or allowed training of individuals to practice that particular technology. So yes, there are provisions that we can do embryological research on mitochondrial donation. It is limited, and we do not have the full range of possibility or testing new technology that would deliver the similar clinical outcome for mitochondrial donation. And that, I think, is one of the issues that is hampering the research in this country to take the technology forward, because there is no research that are targeted specifically to look at the efficiency and the practicality of those procedures.
Yes. So thank you. So the question of whether anyone has compared the costs of this proposed process with the savings should mitochondrial disease be eliminated. This is an important question, and Sean might know whether there have been such studies.
I don't think there's been like an exhaustive health economics-based study, but I think we've certainly been asked this question when we've had conversations with politicians around the introduction of mitochondrial donation. I think the health economics or the financial considerations are pretty grossly self-explanatory. If you compare the incremental cost on an IVF procedure, the incremental cost of what would be incurred to undergo mitochondrial donation would be relatively small. So in terms of what would it cost to have a child through mitochondrial donation, there would be IVF costs. So that can be fairly readily quantified. And it is certainly quite an expensive process, and not necessarily one that is accessible to all Australians based on its finances. But if you compare then on the other side the costs to society on the health system around dealing with a child or a person who ends up having mitochondrial disease, we know that their burden as such on, and I hate to use that term and I don't mean that in any way offensive, but their impact as such on the health system is generally significant. There's often extended stays in hospitals, there's often extended medical procedures, extensive stays in ICU, which we know runs at exorbitant cost per day. So I think it's pretty clear to stack up that the probable or potential costs of a person with mitochondrial disease versus the costs of mitochondrial donation would be far, the cost of mitochondrial disease would be far more significant than the costs of a process of mitochondrial donation.
I could add, and of course one of the other things that's very difficult to quantify is the impact of the disease on the family themselves,
right.
From a social and,
totally.
and mental health perspective.
Well, and also we know that it's often the case where the patient themselves, their work options are limited depending on when the disease affects them, and or their carers are often impacted from a working perspective, which decreases their contribution to paying taxes and society and all of that sort of thing. So spot on. It's the impact of mitochondrial disease is felt to far outweigh the cost of mitochondrial donation.
Thank you. So would it be better to have laws and regulation around this rather than have families go overseas to unregulated countries, in other words, not to the UK? Perhaps that's for John, as a clinician.
Well, in fact, we're aware of this being established in a number of countries already in an unregulated manner. And that is of great concern to us because we have no idea of the abilities and the veracity of the techniques that are being used. And I think particularly for any new technology like this, it's always far better to be able to explore it and validate it in a regulated system. So I think it'd be far better for us to have a system here in Australia that might have a number of regulations associated with it, rather than allowing it to go for families to potentially, who are in a very vulnerable situation, to potentially go offshore to an unregulated site and potentially be at the mercy of these organisations.
Yes. So a questioner asks, I've heard that mito-donation can be likened to organ donation. Would this be an accurate description? Patrick?
In a way, it is, but it is not an organ that we are dealing with. It's part of the genome of a cell that is being transferred or recombined together in a single entity. So I don't think there is enough parallelism between donation of the mitochondria and donation of organ in this context.
And I suppose a couple of other differences are that an organ donation is usually for somebody who's already a fully formed person, and maybe a damaged or diseased organ is replaced with a new heart or new lungs or something of that nature, a new liver. Or it's a blood cell donation, transplant, but it doesn't change the genetic material of every cell. The other thing is that, of course, that transplant only affects that person whereas mitochondrial donation would affect every cell of that person and the children of that person. So there are quite a number of differences when we get down to detail between mitochondrial donation and transplantation.
Yeah, and the only exception to these that would have impact on the next generation in terms of heritable changes would be the donation of an ovary for implantation into the patient who do not have a functional resource of oocyte from the original ovary. In that case, there may be implication of heritable changes, but that is pretty rare.
Yes. Thank you. John, what other options do women with mitochondrial disease have for having children?
So if we focus on mitochondrial DNA-based disease, the options are a couple could abstain from having children. They could elect to have a child naturally with the risk of having a child with a mitochondrial disease. There could be the possibility of egg donation to prevent mitochondrial DNA disease being transmitted. And that has implications in terms of the feelings of the parents with regard to their genetic relatedness to that offspring. There are very few instances where, for specific mitochondrial DNA abnormalities, where an IVF-based procedure akin to prenatal diagnosis can be of benefit, but that is a very small number of instances. And then, of course, there's mitochondrial donation. So they're the various options that are currently available to limited degrees, but of course mitochondrial donation is not available in this country.
So there are potentially several options, but they won't all be applicable to every family.
That's right.
And they all have their pluses and minuses.
Exactly. And so a key thing here is that any couple wanting to explore their options would need to have discussed those various options with qualified geneticists and genetic counsellors so they can work out what is best for them in their own individual circumstances.
So the next question is, I guess it's an aspect of the same question. What are the current options for families without access to mito-donation in Australia? It'll take years they don't have. So in part you've answered that question in the sense that there are alternatives, even if they're not perfect alternatives to mitochondrial donation. But it's certainly true that as it's not currently possible to offer mitochondrial donation in Australia, and if it is introduced, it is going to take some time, then then this is an issue, I'm sure, for families who are seeking to have access to this technology. The next question is it not the case that all unborn children don't have a say in being born? It's not just through this process, but applies to all children. And yes, I think that's certainly true. We've already discussed that a little. I expect that perhaps the one issue here that goes beyond the normal situation, that children don't have a say about being born, is the decision that's being made to change the genetic makeup of the family in a way that will be transmitted not just to that child but also to their children. So there's an extra element here that's beyond the current situation, but of course it's absolutely true that all children, whether they're born through natural reproduction or through IVF or through mito-donation, don't have a say about that decision. So the next question is, I thought we already had a Senate inquiry into this, so why do we need to have this consultation process now? So the Senate inquiry held last year was incredibly important in bringing all of these issues to the fore, and it was an opportunity for the Senate committee to hear from many people who have an interest in the introduction of this technology into Australia and from people who have deep knowledge of the process. But it was not in itself a process that went to the widest spectrum of the community. The Senate inquiry's report made a number of recommendations, and amongst those were that the government should consult broadly with the community about whether to introduce this legislation and what will be the social, the legal, the scientific and the ethical issues. So it's as a result of that that the Minister asked NHMRC to lead this consultation process now. So it's a direct outcome from the Senate inquiry, but it takes the discussion to the next level in seeking to engage as widely as possible across the Australian community. So I hope that answers the question. So I think we've come to the end of the questions, and I want to thank everybody for those questions. They were all really fantastic. They go to the heart of the sorts of issues that we're asking the community to consider, and I really appreciate our 4 experts being willing to engage so effectively with those questions. Now, another question has come up on the screen. I'm wondering how we're going for time. Do we have time for one more? We have a few, so we might run out of time here, but we'll take. First of all, there's a question that's come in: has potential legislation for mitochondrial donation been drafted? To our knowledge, there's been no drafting done because there's been no decision yet taken about whether to change the legislation. But if and when it's legalised, presumably we'd need to have licensed specialist clinics as in the UK, and that is absolutely the case. And I'll ask Diane to comment briefly on that question.
Of course, it will depend on what the government decides, how they're going to go about this process. But certainly in the UK, because the process is seen as being so complex and still not certain, it was decided that it should only be applied by very specialist clinics that have the appropriate training, and there should be oversight from the body in Australia, in the UK, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, which has the mandate to make sure that the legislation is properly enforced, that everything is properly monitored, and so on. So I suspect that if it were the case that this was legalised in Australia, Australia would have to think about establishing similar processes to make sure that it's appropriately regulated.
Yes, thank you very much. As indeed IVF clinics are at the moment.
Yes, of course, I should have mentioned that, yes.
So thank you very much, and thank you again to all 4 of you for your answers to this very interesting set of questions. So now I'd like to encourage everybody who's interested in this topic to read the mitochondrial donation issues paper that's on our website at www.nhnmrc.gov.au/mito. We encourage everyone to provide us with a written submission, because every submission we receive will be considered and taken seriously and will add to the overall advice that we can give back to government at the end of the year. There are other ways to be involved as well, so please check the website and consider attending our coming public forums. So thank you to everyone who's participated today. It's been a fantastic discussion, and I hope it's been useful in answering some of your questions. Thank you very much.